You're listening to the weekly parsha podcast with Ari Goldwag, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat B'Shemesh Israel, 5777, 2017. This week's parsha is Parshas Re'eh, and I'd like to remind you, I haven't reminded you in a while, about my sefer, Perfectly Imperfect, available right now in Svarim stores throughout the world, breaking out of the ordinary and striving for greatness. Great addition to your Jewish library. And in this week's parsha, I'd like to share with you a thought on the pasuk. The pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu, like we spoke about last week, where we're entering into the land of Israel. The Jewish people are about to get there. They're about to reach that amazing milestone in their history. And the verse tells us in verse 20, Ki yarchiv Hashem lakechas gevulcha. It actually speaks about a future time when Hashem will expand the borders of the land of Israel, kasher diber lach, as God has spoken to you. Okay, but soon we'll see what exactly the pasuk, the verse is talking about, what's going to happen when we get there. But it's just interesting that we speak about this expansion, and the verse tells us like this: V'amarta, and you will say, Oichla basar, I would like to eat some meat. I enjoy eating meat. Ki sa'ava nafshecha lechol basar, because your soul will desire to eat meat. It's permitted, the Torah says that it's permitted to eat meat. Verse 21, the verse tells us that let's say you're distant from Jerusalem, let's say you're distant from the place that Hashem will choose to place His name there, that the korbanos are to be brought there. Right? Ordinarily, what the Jewish people, as we'll soon see, the Midrashim speak about the fact that the Jewish people, when they were in the Midbar, when they were in the wilderness, so they were accustomed to eating meat only in the context of the korbanos, of the sacrifices. If they wanted to have meat otherwise, they were not permitted to eat meat if they just desired to have meat. They could only have it if they brought a sacrifice to Hashem, to God. By doing so, it permitted the meat to be eaten. Otherwise, they weren't allowed to. But the verse is telling us when they get into the land of Israel, when they enter into Israel, so then it will indeed be permitted for them to eat meat even without bringing a korban. So then it will be permitted to slaughter from your cattle, from your sheep, that God has given to you, as He has commanded to you. And you shall eat it in your gates. You don't have to go all the way to Jerusalem in order to bring a korban, to bring a sacrifice in order to eat meat, but rather wherever you are, as long as you go through the proper slaughtering procedure in order that it should be kosher, it fulfills all the requirements, so it's permitted to eat meat. A very interesting idea. But what's most interesting, and we need to understand the connection between these two ideas, is the verse starts off, in that first verse we read, verse 20, it speaks about the expansion. Ki yarchiv Hashem elekechas gevulcha. When God will expand your borders. What is the idea of expansion? And what is the idea of expansion in relationship to this concept of now being able to eat meat? Something which was not permitted before. We'll see that the verse talks about matir asurim, that God permits certain things that previously were not permitted. This is an example of one of those things that was not permitted. It was not permitted to eat meat unless one was bringing a sacrifice. Now it's going to be permitted. What is the idea of expansion of the land of Israel? What is the idea of expansion in this context of eating meat and something being permitted which was not permitted before? I'd like to read you this in the Midrash. Teidelecha, you should know. Hashem originally had made it forbidden to slaughter and to eat unless a person brought it to the opening, to the doorway of the tent of meeting, to the temple. How do we know this? Shemar verse tells us, if a person shall not bring it to the doorway of the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, and bring it for God. The verse tells us that a person, heaven forbid, will experience spiritual excision. They'll be cut off from their nation, heaven forbid, if they eat meat in the wrong context. Maksiv Sham. So the verse says, if a person does not bring it there to be brought as a sacrifice, will be considered like spilled blood. Like we said, such a person will be cut off. But the verse here tells us that at this point, when the Jewish people get into the land of Israel, somehow there's a harchava, there's an expansion, and now it's going to become permitted for the Jewish people to eat meat. The verse tells us that now at this point, whenever you want it, whenever you desire to have meat, not just because you're bringing a sacrifice, it's permitted. How do we know this? From the fact that the verse tells us that Hashem will expand your borders. So the first example that the Medrash gives us of an expansion is this expansion that something which was previously forbidden now becomes permitted. So we need to understand what is the idea of expansion. Now, the Medrash tells us the next piece in the Medrash, which is in parsha, we're in parsha Daled, the fourth section of the Medrash in Medrash Rabbah of Sefer Devarim, and the next section, which is section 7, speaks about a different expansion. I'm not going to read it inside, but just to give you an idea, the Medrash speaks about the expansion, brings a pasuk in Tehillim, Al Gila ve'esmecha b'chazdecha. The verse tells us that King David said, I will rejoice. The double lashon, I will rejoice, agila ve'esmecha, and I will rejoice, lashon simcha, in your kindness. Asher says on you saw my challenge, my difficulty. Yodata b'tzares nafshi, you knew the oppression, the constriction of my soul. But you didn't leave me in the hands of my enemies. The verse tells us that David HaMelech says, you stood me up in an expanded way. You stood my legs up in an expanded way. So the sages tell us that what is this verse referring to? What was King David speaking about? He wasn't just speaking about himself, but he was speaking about Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph, that he had a tremendous amount of difficulties, a tremendous amount of tsaris. He lived in a place of constriction. He was challenged with the wife of Potiphar, that she tried to seduce him, tried to get him to do an aver, to do sins. And there were other challenges that he went through. But in the end, Hashem paid him off. He paid him back for the challenges, for the difficulties, and he ended up in a place of expansion. He was freed from his many years of being in jail, and ultimately he became the king, the second only to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, as we know the story. So what's very interesting is that we see that the Torah is saying a lashon of ki yarchiv, which is an expansion, and we're saying that it parallels a different expansion, which is the expansion of Yosef HaTzadik, that somehow Joseph went through difficulties, went through challenges, and ultimately he came out of those challenges, and he became greater for those challenges, and he was expanded. He became the king over Egypt. So we have a concept here of expansion. And what's interesting to me is that in our verse, it just speaks about the expansion. It doesn't speak about the constriction, which is before the expansion. This verse speaks about tsaris nafshi, speaks about the constriction, the challenge, and then hamartav hamerchav raglai. But I think that what we see here is that when the Torah uses the word ki yarchiv, that there's an expansion of the gvulim, there's an expansion of the boundaries of the land of Israel. That implies that at first there was a constriction. That's what the Medrash is coming to teach us. Just like by Yosef HaTzadik, he lived in a place of difficulty, of challenge. The result was, ultimately, he came out of those challenges and he was expanded. He became a king. So too, when it comes to the verse here, there's something which is an expansion. There's an expanding of the borders. And interestingly, there's something which we see, which is parallel clearly, which we spoke about previously, which is something which was not permitted, which was the eating of meat. Whenever a person wanted to eat meat, that was constricted. It wasn't permitted. It was only permitted under certain circumstances. That became expanded and became permitted. Okay, so we have already two concepts, two places where we see original constriction and an expansion, which parallels somehow the expansion of the land of Israel, which it seems will be in the future. Now, the third example that the Medrash gives us is a pretty famous story with Abba Yuden. Abba Yuden had been an extremely wealthy person, and whenever the sages would come to his town, he would give a tremendous amount of money for tzedakah, a tremendous amount of charity, so that the sages should be able to study Torah, to learn Torah. And what happened? Abba Yuden, unfortunately, lost all of his money, became extremely poor. But he didn't know what to do. He wanted to still give tzedakah. He felt very bad. The sages came to his town. They were collecting again for the yeshiva. So Abba Yuden hid it in his attic. He didn't want to come out. He didn't want to come down. His wife says to him, "What are you doing, my dear husband? Why are you hiding? Why are you staying in the attic? Why don't you come down? Why don't you go out to work?" And he explained to her that he felt very bad. The sages had come to collect money, but he didn't have the money to give. He felt really, really horrible. So his wife was a great tzaddikas, says the Medrash. She was very righteous, and she also wanted to be involved in the mitzvah of tzedakah. So she said to her husband, "Listen, we have one field left. That one field, let's take that field. Let's split that field in half. Let's sell half the field, and then we'll take that money, we'll give it to tzedakah, and at least for now, we'll be able to fulfill the obligation of charity. We can't do it. We can't give as much perhaps as we could have." And that's what he did. And he took that field, he sold it for 5 golden coins. And he took the 5 golden coins, and in an embarrassed way, he said to the rabbis, he said to them, "In the past, I was able to give more. And this is how much I can give right now." And he said to them, "I'd like you to pray for me. Pray that I should have an expansion. Pray for me that I should have success in my business because I've lost all of my money." And the sages saw what had happened, and they prayed for him. And an amazing thing happened. Not long after that, in the part of the field that he retained, the second part of the field that he had not sold, so he was digging there and he was tilling the soil, and he came across a treasure that was buried underneath his field. And he was able, as a result of that treasure, not only was he as rich as he was before, but he became even richer. So the sages said to him, they had prayed for him, and they saw that indeed this verse that we're speaking about, that Hashem will expand your gvul. And interestingly, the verse right before our verse says, and this is a verse in chapter 12, verse 19, that the verse speaks about the obligation to give charity. The Levites are those who serve God in the temple. They don't have so much money. They don't have so much wherewithal. And nevertheless, they serve Hashem. So there's an obligation the Torah gives us to give charity to them. And right after that, the verse says, that there will be an expansion as a result of a person being willing to give charity. It seems like he's constricting himself. He's taking away from himself. And Abba Yuden, certainly, he gave up half of his property, and he gave all of that money to the sages to be able to study Torah. It seems like he was constricting himself. But as a result of that, as a result of the prayers of the sages on his behalf, as a result of his great self-sacrifice on behalf of the sages, so he merited to find a great treasure, and there was an expansion that resulted. So we see a third place, and it's very interesting. Why didn't Hashem just give him? He always gave to the sages. He always gave money. He always gave charity to them. So why did Hashem take away his money? And then he had to give half of his property to the sages, and then all of a sudden he found even more money, became even richer. What's the idea here? We see again this concept that there's a constriction that occurs by, we saw it with the Isser, not being able to eat the meat wherever you want it. That's one level, and then it becomes permitted. The second level we saw was in regards to Yosef HaTzadik. He had difficulties, he had challenges. Ultimately became the king, one of the most expanded human beings with so much power over the greatest power at that time, which was the land of Egypt. Because of his constriction, because of his difficulty, because of his challenge. That's what we're seeing. And finally we have Abba Yuden, that he lost all of his money. As a result of that, he constricted himself. He was willing still to give tzedakah, still to give charity. The result was he came out with an amazing wealth. So those are the 3 examples that we see here. And ultimately, the last piece that the Medrash speaks about is the fact that in the future time, when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, so there's going to be an incredible expansion of the land of Israel. And it gives us many different verses, but what's very interesting is it quotes a verse which we saw in last week's parsha, I believe it was, that Eretz Yisrael is a land which is full of mountains. It's a mountainous area, and Hashem in the future is going to flatten all of the mountains and all of the valleys. What is the idea of Hashem flattening this land? So Medrash tells us an amazing thing. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, I'd like to read it inside. This is in section 11. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Megillah hazayis ein adam yodea kam orka v'kam rochba. When a person has a Megillah, which is a scroll, you have a Torah scroll, so it's all wrapped up. It's all rolled up, and you don't know how long it is. You can't really see because it's rolled up. And then the Mekama Arka V'Kama Rachba, you don't know how tall it is, you don't know how short it is, you don't know how long it is. Kishinif Himoidas Kamahi. But when it's opened up, when a person opens it and extends it, then you can see the expansion. Through the expansion, you can see what was constricted into that space. Kach Eretz Yisrael. It's an amazing thing, the Medrash says. In the same way, the land of Israel. Kol Ruba Har Mugvois. Most of Israel has mountains and it has valleys. Minayin shenemar. How do we know? The verse tells us. The land that you're going there is a land of mountains and valleys. God's eyes are constantly looking at it, like we said. So it has mountains and valleys. In the future, we find that the verse tells us that God is going to straighten out all the mountains and all of the valleys. How do we know this? The verse tells us in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 4, all of those that are low, Hashem is going to raise up. All of those that are high, all of the mountains, Hashem is going to flatten. Everything will be flattened out. Okay? We'll see an expansion. Now, it's very interesting. You would think that what the verse is saying is that all of the mountains are going to be flattened, and so there'll be less surface area, right? If you take a mountain and you knock it out and you flatten it, so you have less surface area, right? No, the Medrash is telling us an amazing thing, that when Hashem flattens the mountain, the land will expand around the mountain, and so in so doing, Hashem will expand the land of Israel, meaning the surface area of Israel will stay the same, but it will be spread over a greater amount of area, physical area, because it will be flattened and straightened out. Amazing thing. Very interesting idea. So just like you have a scroll, which you can't see because it's constricted. How big is it? How large is it really? You can't see. When you have mountains, how much surface, you have to do many calculations to figure out the surface area. So too, when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, you're going to have this flattening. You're going to have this expansion that occurs. Now, the idea that you see here is that the constriction itself gets opened up. That which we can't figure out. How tall the mountain is, what's the space of the mountain, how much surface area does the mountain have, requires great calculations. It's something which needs unraveling. You need to figure it out, right? That's going to be figured out. It's going to be straightened out and clarified. It'll be clear, and Eretz Yisrael will be expanded and enlarged, and it will make room for the many, many Jews who will be returning to Israel, and the many, many Jews who will come back to life in Tchias HaMesim, in the revival of the dead. And the verses, there are many beautiful verses the Medrash quotes. It's worth seeing at the end of our parsha, right here, speaking about the future time, what's going to be when Mashiach, when Messiah arrives. But the idea is an amazing idea. The idea is, think about a rope. You have a long string or a rope, and there are many, many knots in that rope. You have many, many constrictions. Hashem is matir asurim, right? We said that Hashem permits that which was forbidden. The forbidden meat, you weren't allowed to eat the meat unless it was with a sacrifice. Now it's permitted. There's an untying of the bound. What happens when you untie a string that has many knots in it? So the string seemed small at first, but then as you untie it, the string gets larger and larger and larger as you untie one knot and another knot and another knot and another knot. And ultimately you see the full length of the string. Just like the Megillah, just like that scroll which was rolled up. You unroll it and you can see how amazingly long it is. The idea is that the constriction itself, the verse is Ki Yarchiv Hashem Elokecha Gevulcha, means there's no such thing as an expansion without a constriction. There's no such thing as experiencing, in our realm, in our world, there's no such thing as experiencing an expansion in one's life without going through a challenge, without going through a constriction. And it's not just that the constriction or the challenge or the difficulty is something that you need to get through in order to get to the other side. And then once you've gotten to the other side, you experience a wonderful, receive wonderful light. No, the darkness itself is the light. The constriction, that very string is tied up, and you untie it, and now you have that beautiful long string. That very scroll is rolled up. You can't see what's there until you unroll, until you unravel it. The challenge itself, the difficulty, Yosef HaTzadik is the ultimate example of this. He's somebody who had to go through all of these challenges, all of these difficulties. He proved himself by getting through those challenges, and the result was he became a great person, he became a king because of his challenges. He rejoiced because of his challenges. The verse tells us in the 4th chapter of Tehillim, Batsar hirchaftali. In the constriction, you expanded me, the verse tells us. The result of the constriction, of the challenge, is an expansion. When do we get to that expansion? At the end of time, after the Jewish people has gone through all of the different trials and tribulations, the travails that we have indeed gone throughout the inquisitions and the tat v'tach and the marauding and all of the challenges and difficulties and holocausts, which we don't understand, we don't see it yet. We haven't unraveled that scroll completely. We've begun to start to see Hashem returning us to the land of Israel. The beginning of the expansion of our borders. Only the beginning we have seen already. And more is yet to come. But the idea is that the challenge, the willingness to be constricted. I'm not going to eat meat unless it's in the context of a sacrifice originally. Now when I get to that place, which is Eretz Yisrael, where things are expanded, now I can enjoy that meat whenever I want to. I've gone through that challenge. I've gone through that wilderness. I've traveled 40 years through the desert. Now I've gotten to Eretz Yisrael. Now I've gotten to the land of Israel. I've been willing to have that constriction, that difficulty. Yosef HaTzadik went through 12 years of challenge until he became the king over the land of Egypt. He was willing. He knew that was what was building him. Abba Yuden, he was poor. He lost everything. But he was willing to constrict himself further. I'm going to give up half of my land. I'm going to sell it in order to give it to tzedakah. When a person gives charity, it's very difficult to give charity. It's very hard to take from my money, my hard-earned money, and give it to somebody else. He didn't earn it. Why should I give it to him? By constricting oneself, it brings in amazing blessings. It brings in amazing expansion. That's what the Medrash is teaching us. That's what the Torah is teaching us. That's the message of this beautiful parsha. When Hashem will expand our boundaries. I want to bless you, and I want to ask you to bless me back. Hashem should help us, that we should be able to face our challenges, be able to recognize that the tsar, the place of constriction, is just a tied knot, which when we open up that constriction, we experience the harchava, the expansion. Hashem should help us to recognize that and to be able to face the challenges and know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a harchava, there's an expansion, which Hashem should help us to be able to see. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.